Noisecast.
Noisecast and episode 16. Since Noise Extra seems to be on some sort of a small vacation, Noisecast runs to the rescue. So you are listening to Noisecast. Max Julian Eastman was on a small tour in Finland last week, playing 3 shows in Helsinki, Tampere and Turku, and he was kind enough to also to be interviewed by Noisecast. So that will be the guest for this episode. But before we get into that interview / discussion, there is some new releases from Finland to be talked about. And the first one that came into my mind that I have acquired recently was, I think, the debut tape of Finno-Ugrian Suicide Hypothesis. The tape is called Kansamme Kuolema, which translates to the death of our nation. First thing that struck me about this tape is the presentation itself. The cover paper really looks like this. It has been treated such way that it looks like it's been laying in a warehouse or an attic of an old house for decades and decades. Looks like it has been gathering, like it's been wet at some point or something like that. Very nice touch. The material itself on the tape is very crude. I would almost put it under a category of power electronics. Lots of feedback, samples, and shouty vocals. The name itself of the project, Finno-Ugrian Suicide Hypothesis, is an actual real hypothesis about the tendency for Finno-Ugrian people to end themselves abruptly through their own hands. I think the project has also played some live shows which I haven't been able to witness myself. But the tape itself is a really nice game opener, so to speak. It's very thought out, and I think all the material on the tape justifies itself. It's very nicely recorded, sounds are clear, but also very rugged and rough. If you can get your hands on this tape, even if it's still available, I'm not sure, but high recommendations. next thing that came into my hands is not a tape, it's a CDr, which is a format that I myself I'm usually quite wary of, but it so happens to be that the Haaska CDr is a CDr. It says it's recorded live with 4 microphones, no overdubs, no mastering. Also has these slogans, anti-human, anti-life and anti-music. Goes well with the tradition of power electronics. When I listened to this CDr, the first thing that came into my mind was this is like this very 2010 filth and violence worship type of material. But since I don't know much about this artist, I can't say if filth and violence has been an influence, but definitely can be heard. But if your influences are kind of old filth and violence type of crude noise and power electronics industrial, I mean, how can you not like that? I really am interested to hear more of this project once it starts to gain more momentum, and maybe play some live gigs as well. Why not? And here is how Haaska sounds like. The last release to be talked about is, I believe it's a side project of Rautakymi. The project is called Parasocial Juche. And I believe, well, when you think about the name, themes are obviously about North Korea and their way of running the country. The material itself is, well, it has, I think, like these North Korean propaganda pop songs playing in the background, really heavy tape manipulation. And what I really like about this release is that he has succeeded to kind of shed all those so-called trademark elements of Rautakymi and transform this project to something completely different. It is definitely in the same soundscape. There is still that really rough tone to the recording, but with the tape manipulations and some bursts of feedback, it is much more constrained and sounds much more controlled than Rautakymi. This is a very interesting take on the subject as well, so I definitely encourage everyone to be in contact with Rautakymi and see if you can catch a copy of this tape yourself. As mentioned in the beginning, Max Julian Eastman was on tour in Finland. Unfortunately, myself wasn't able to attend any of these gigs, but there was plenty of reports, and they seem to vary quite a lot. Helsinki gig, some people seem to think that it kind of ended abruptly, but I guess it wasn't abruptly after all. But like mentioned in this upcoming interview, every gig is different every time. And when I was reading those reports, it really seemed to be so. And venues were all quite different. Helsinki I haven't been to this gig space, but I've heard lots of good things about it. And it looks really great in pictures, like has this really dark atmosphere. And I think all the venues were in a good way different. This kind of dark grotto in Helsinki, then in Tampere this quite nice villa type of atmosphere with wooden house and all that kind of breathing space, and then ending up to Turku in a very brutal industrial setting. So it was kind of a nice assortment of gig places that are quite, no, well, not quite, but typical in Finland anyway. There is variation. But without further ado, we go to the very interesting conversation that Mikko of Sarvilevyt had with Max. So get yourself comfortable and have a listen what the man have to say.
My name is Max Julian Eastman. I run the Tribe Tapes record label based out of the United States. I also perform music both under my own name as well as Tantric Death and a plethora of other aliases.
At the moment of recording this, you are in Finland doing the Finnish tour, 3 dates, and some of the listeners may have heard your interview in White Centipede Noise podcast.
Yes.
And originally I was thinking that because everybody has heard that interview, we wouldn't necessarily need to go into all the, let's say, similar details. But all the people I have been talking recently, none of them has been listening that interview yet. So I think there is actually this audience who might not be listening White Centipede interviews, but they will listen this for whatever reason. And so you don't need to worry if you are repeating some of the same things. One of the things that surprised me was that how small Tribe Tapes was early on, when you was mentioning like making tapes of like 30 copies or something like that.
Yeah.
And what was the original idea of Tribe Tapes? Did you have any intention to actually be recognized more wider? Was it intentional to just do so small editions?
Yeah, I never had any intent of running a record label on any large scale whatsoever. Originally, Tribe Tapes, it began as a name to put on the tapes I was producing as Great Humor, which was my first noise project. So I did a few Great Humor tapes as the first Tribe releases, all limited to 25 copies or less. I decided at some point, because I'd been greatly inspired by the 80s cassette culture underground, to try my hand at a various artist compilation. And that became Tribe Tapes Volume 1, which had my own work and a few harsh noise artists like Black Lever Jesus and some 80s pioneers like Martin Newell. And from there, I kind of got into the idea of doing reissues because I'd already been contacting some of these older guys over Facebook just to pick their brain about what it was like trading tapes back then. And I believe the first reissue I put out was the French artist Collectibility. I did a cassette reissue of a tape he'd originally put out in the early 90s of waltzes and almost very fairy tale-like music. And the reception of that one was positive enough that I looked more into doing releases by other artists. Soon afterwards, I came into possession of a Manoy cassette that PBK, Manoy's estate holder, had never heard before, so he gave me his blessing to issue that. That cassette was called Sum Sum Sue. And from there, I kind of started networking more with people. If anyone reached out and had an album they wanted to release and I thought it was decent enough, I'd put it out. But very early on, Tribe Tapes didn't really have as much as a concrete identity as it does now. I feel like the label nowadays focuses primarily on very surreal music. Even in the context of noise, I have a preference for the bizarre, psychedelic, or very low fidelity.
Your label became very quickly sort of established here. It sort of appeared out of nowhere and suddenly felt like half of the scene is talking about something that Tribe Tape is doing, and I never thought that the editions would be so small. When I realized that you were doing even all these names that everybody seems to be talking about, and then you made 50 tapes. That we started trading at some point, but you also had been trading with 100,000, who was also pushing kind of related sounds into Finnish audiences.
Yes. Very much the Tatu Hata I look at as kind of a Finnish parallel to what I'm doing. Similarly, Vilho has a very wide range of noise that he puts out on the label. And I'm very attracted to Finnish noise for a number of reasons. I appreciate the very minimalist approach it often has, often involving scrap metal or electroacoustic sources. I believe I got in contact with Tatu Hata sometime around the end of 2021. I'd been listening to a few of their releases on Bandcamp, and initially I just wanted to procure some personal copies. This is before Tribe Tapes I really sought out any distribution for the label. Again, these are such small editions initially that I didn't really consider it to be a possibility, but I got in touch with Tatu Hata shortly after I'd done some of the first CD releases on the label, Smell and Quim, and a reissues of a few of the earlier cassette reissues by Jen Ken and Klimpere. So already I had a little bit of a presence, a little bit of a back catalog built up. So Tatu Hata gave me the proposition of doing a little bit of a distro trade, stocking some Tribe Tape stuff over there. And shortly thereafter, I believe I got in contact with you as well for a CD trade. And I've been very, very pleased with the reception the label has had in Europe. I do find it pretty surprising, too, especially for a label to come up as quickly as Tribe has, I do look at it as a blessing and a curse. I don't want anyone to get tired out on what I do so quickly. I feel like when you're kind of catapulted into the front like that, that's definitely a possibility, so that's why I try to spread things out a little bit more and not release a whole lot at one time or anything, or make my social media presence too obnoxious, only a little obnoxious.
I think you had a quite strong emphasis about tribe tapes being partially kind of in spirit of the old tape scene, not only because of like reissuing some of the like original tape culture releases, but also that getting recognized by like larger scene is not as important as the kind of personal networking with people who actually care.
Yeah. I mean, any artist that I release on the label at this point, I release because I'm personally invested in their work. I care a lot about it. If somebody reaches out with a submission and I'm not really sure who it is, it doesn't really fit with what I do with the label, I'll pass on it. But it's never been my intention to impress the scene or even really have any presence in any live performance circles. The state I live in America, North Carolina, is very cut off from the rest of the national noise scene, which I guess is more congregated around the Northeast, places like New York or Pennsylvania. There isn't very much in the way of shows in North Carolina, and when there are noise shows, typically the turnout is very poor. You know, you could have the artists and maybe 5 to 10 people, 20 on a good day will come out. So the live arena never had too much interest to me, geographically speaking. So my interest in noise is really spawned by researching 80s and 90s cassette culture artists. When I was in college, during my free time, I would browse Blogspot, these old blogs like Tape Attack, No Longer Forgotten Music, Bleak Bliss. I would post a lot of cassette rips. And from there, I kind of built what I liked about noise from what I was hearing in 80s and 90s stuff, kind of these real-world, environmental, or otherwise very musical sounds reappropriated in a collage or noise context.
Back then also the line between what was accepted as a noise was maybe more diverse. That when you get some of the 80s or 90s tapes, what we understand as a noise now might be a little bit more narrow. In your own work, it doesn't always constitute only like a blasting distortion, but you have like weird musical elements there. And even like Randy Grief, I don't really think him as a like electroacoustic artist or something. I always thought because he put out stuff on Triple R or records, and I always associated him to be kind of a noise artist.
And Grief would regard his own work as noise too, even though it's very musical, almost more in line with what you'd expect from post-punk or some kind of gothic experimental music. He still very much considers it to be in the vein of noise.
Yeah.
And I think that shows, too, you mentioned Triple R. Their very early releases, like the Testament LP or the 7-inch box set that they put out, it did have that very academic focus where, you know, Ron had a lot of interest in people like David Tudor and early pioneers of noise.
Yeah.
And I feel like people like Randy Grief or PBK, they took a lot of influence from that 70s school of electroacoustic noise, like people like Tudor or Gordon Mumma, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a kind of a tradition that's overlooked nowadays if people are getting into noise. Now people's first exposure to noise will be Def Pilo or Macronympho or the Rita, which I will have a massive amount of respect for, obviously, but I think if that's the first thing you are hearing in noise, it's going to give you a very limited box of what you accept noise to be. I feel like if people went back more and listened to more of the pioneers from the 80s or 70s, for instance, it could definitely provide more inspiration for people not to just blast all the time, but try to work in more absurdity and sparseness in their own work.
Yeah, this is something I have been discussing with some of my friends, that there is quite often element in contemporary noise that it doesn't matter where it comes from, it is the kind of same thing. I know it's not entirely true, obviously, but checking out this documentary of Indonesian harsh noise, and then seeing that the Indonesian harsh noise artists play exactly the same harsh noise as the American guys with a cap on, table with certain pedals and shaker with something inside, and they create the exact kind of stereotype of what is harsh noise. The whole history of noise shows you huge diversity of approaches, and then we would kind of have this massive amount of people who participate in noise just in form of shaker boxes and distortions, or like modular synthesizers, basically same gear sold by companies who sell gear that is possible to use for noise. But like in your case, both label and your own noise, I think I can't really see any of these like noise device noise bands, if you know what I mean. So your work is like, I can't say what are the tools you are actually using in your stuff.
With the work I do as Tantric Def, it's definitely inspired more by, as we were saying, stereotypical harsh noise. Tantric Def, in America, there's this construct where people talk about egg punk and chain punk. Egg punk is like wacky shit like Devo, and then chain punk is fucking, I don't know, blasphemy or some war metal or some shit. Tantric Def is like very intentionally cheesy, playing into those tropes. I use a Digitech death metal, I use a Boss pitch shifter, I use a lot of pedals for Tantric because I do love the stereotypical noise approach too, but for the work I do, and I produce under my own name, and to another extent a lot of the work that I put out on Tribe Tapes, I don't really go for pedal noise as much as people using household devices, cassette tapes, and experimenting it in a way that feels natural and exciting for them. Primarily I use cassette players in my work, or VCRs. My debut CD, Model of Malehood, which I put out a few years ago, I composed that by lining a couple of VCRs into a Casio SK1 and then a Chaos pad, and it's all these 5-6 second loops that are just layered on top of each other and progress very, very slowly. I take a lot of pride in recording environmental or otherwise not noisy sounds deep into the red on a 4-track recorder and constantly dubbing that tape over and over and processing it and degrading it to try to get really harsh, broken sounds without having to use any pedals or gear that's made intentionally for making noise.
There obviously is experimentation in noise these days as well, but there used to be a lot of more artists, also like US, something like, let's say, Eric Lund, for example, that he would just have this idea, could be just like repeating sentence and redubbing or recycling or re-amplifying again and again. And if Noise fan buys Merzbow CD published by Relapse, he can expect like it's going to be this kick-ass noise album. But when you buy Eric Lund CD or Hands 2 or something, it might be like, why I'm listening. It's like almost on the threshold of questioning yourself, like why I'm listening this material, when it's like not really anything to do with music. It's more like experiments.
Yes, exactly. And you mentioned the process Lund would go through of dubbing the same sounds to cassette over and over. It's almost a direct successor to what sound artists like Alvin Lucier would do. It's very seminal work. I'm sitting in a room. He'd repeat just the same few sentences and let it decay over and over again until his spoken word turned into basically a wash of just low fidelity, very ambient noise. Lund and Hands 2, for instance, very much prove themselves to be the direct successors to that, using consumer technology, 4-tracks, to bring into the home what sound artists like Lucier had previously only been able to do in an academic context.
Kind of art of field recording into something else. Same with Lund. I think you might have been reading this text about it's not field recording, but it's recording field.
Topographical studies, yes.
And it changes even if you would be used to some of the like early field recordings or even contemporary field recordings, usually hands to when he uses something like old Walkman or something, it gives very airy, like almost haunted atmosphere in the recordings, which is very different from a lot of field recordings that's like the intention is to
high fidelity,
yeah.
mostly unaltered, trying to present the field recordings as they are, while hands 2 would process them a little bit further. Again, the Casio SK1, as I mentioned, was a big instrument in my own work. Hands 2 would use that and just a few tape players on those very early cassettes, and was able to transform field recordings into this very obscure, cryptic wash of noise.
With these artists is also the way they treat or release. Same with the mail art. When most of us come from music background in a way that we have this fixed idea what it means to publish a recording, and it usually involves idea of getting it into somewhere for sale and selling out certain number edition. But many of these older noise artists may have just done recording and seem to be quite it seems to be quite irrelevant for them. Does it sell? It's on the catalog and they will dub it for you, or they have a certain edition, but it's not like this idea of music album.
Yes, because nowadays in noise, and I guess to a greater extent music in general, there's a very speculative market that's built around it where people want to produce purposely scarce limited edition releases in order to entice people to buy it now out of fear of missing out later, essentially. Well, the progenitors of cassette culture, take Sound of Pig for instance. Al Margolis to this day keeps a large number of the 80s Sound of Pig catalog in print. I don't believe his cassette dubbing deck is working anymore, but if you email him and pay him and send him a list of the releases you want, he'll send you scans of the original master artwork and master audio, even the cassette labels for you to assemble the release at home. And Al has no concern for limited edition releases. And it's funny because in retrospect, the fact that he's still producing some of these releases, even into the 2000s, you'll see a market on Discogs where people will pay more for specifically Sound of Pig releases that were actually produced in the 80s.
Yeah.
But the amusing thing about that is, realistically, the new dubs that Margolis makes are actually a lot higher quality. He uses very nice chrome tapes. He dubs them on a much better deck. In comparison, a lot of the 80s Sound of Pig tapes, the levels won't even approach anywhere in the red. It's very barely audible, but for a very specific demographic, that's what they want more because of the collectors or archivist market.
You were talking about Zan Hoffman.
Zan Hoffman, yeah. Yes.
He was one of the examples who has such a massive output that it would not make sense to mass produce the releases, really. But they would be sort of the limitation happens in different way. Like now when somebody does like hand numbered 50 and it sells in a couple of hours, it's a very different thing than somebody in old days releasing a tape, keeping it available for a few years, possibly selling 30 copies. There's no way to like inform people. You could only wait for flyers to circulate or send letters to people you knew and mention you have something new out, and it worked very differently.
And they weren't necessarily produced as products either. You know, you mentioned Zan Hoffman with his imprint Zidsik, then he renamed it Zid Slick. A whole bunch of different names, but he finally settled on ZH27, because he produced close to 2,000 tapes in a 27-year time frame. And these cassettes were not intended to be commercial objects at all. Usually they were each 30-minute programs, and he would dub 2 programs onto a C60 tape. So this wasn't made for a Discogs market whatsoever. In fact, it's really quite convoluted to try to archive these tapes on Discogs, because he'll mix and match different programs on each side of the cassette to make it a personalized experience to the person who received it in a trade. And this is a very common thing in the 80s underground, where people didn't really obey the formula that a release is something very solid and it shouldn't be modified. Ken Klinger was another artist in the 80s where he produced a lot of series where it'd just be his initials, KC, and then it would be numbered sequentially. For instance, you come out with a tape KC5, but depending on the length of the tape, he'd make a variation where one side would be KC5 Volume 2, other side would be KC6 Volume 1 or whatever, and it would only have a selection of tracks from the actual complete KC5 or KC6 release. People weren't intending these things to be archived or speculated on like they are now, and there's really more of a purity to that approach that I respect a lot more than just trying to make something to sell out or pressure people to buy it as soon as possible. Let's say one person marks your release as a full-length album on Discogs. When people talk about it for the foreseeable future, that is the information they have to go by, which is unfortunate because it's user-submitted and not on the part of the label whatsoever. And it wouldn't really be a problem if people didn't treat Discogs as the end-all, be-all for music archiving and databases.
Yeah. I remember there was a Southern Infant was also annoyed when there was just like a personalized copy of LP, and somebody listed that as a like alternative version that exists, and then he was like, well, it's not. It exists, but it's not something that is available. It was just like a personal thing, and
people are less prone to producing just one-of-one releases as gifts for friends because there's suddenly this option that someone could list that on Discogs and try to profit off of some way that you didn't intend. Basically dismantling your original intent for the release and turning it into something else, which, when it comes down to it, I suppose, is something we shouldn't really care about.
Yeah.
I guess we should just produce our own work for our own work's sake and not worry about how it's perceived by the public, but regardless, it still seems to be something that we take into consideration.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, I fully realize how kind of almost lame it is to even consider it, but then I can also admit to myself that still on the back of my head, it is something that comes into my mind when I think about it.
The way I've decided to combat these feelings of worrying how my work could be misrepresented is by purposely making my work as confusing as possible under different imprints. I've been producing tapes for a while under the Purveyor's imprint, but I'll put a different label on different copies of the same tape. Like the same tape on one person's copy could be labeled as Purveyor's Arm of Distribution, and the next one will be Purveyor's Ministry of Information. And it's the same tape, it's the same exact release, but I just put a different sticker label on it because I want people to be confused when they're trying to put this into Discogs or trying to figure out what this is. I like there to be some sort of mystery when people have these things, like feel like it's actually unique and not just a consumer product where someone places an order with duplication, they got a box full of tapes with labels already on it, and these really crappy inserts that look like they were made for Pitchfork or something. Yeah. This is a factory line production style of a lot of noise labels where they just send everything in without having any physical labor in it whatsoever. With Tribe releases, yes, I'll have them professionally dubbed just because these are such large editions now due to demand that I want them to turn out right, but I still have that handmade process in cutting all the inserts myself, printing it at home, designing the sticker labels, because I feel like you can't give up the DIY aspect of tape making or you're kind of giving up the ghost, so to speak.
Yeah. it's not just like something you order from the factory, but you do the tape because it somehow gives you satisfaction to make it.
So there's joy involved with creating it.
Yeah. And so when you take a joy out of making tapes, then suddenly like what remains as an artist or as a label, you should be more focusing on like even communicating with people who are interested in what you do, not like pushing into market or trying to join some former scene. And
it feels very much people want to make noise sometimes to further their own identity as an artist rather than trying to just make something to share with other people. You know, there's a very strong propensity in noise where people will cold call labels, so to speak, like labels they've never made any contact with before and send in a demo. And I don't understand why you'd want to send in your work to a label unless you have some kind of personal connection to it. It seems like people could have the idea that, oh, this label seems to be putting out a lot of popular releases, so it should be a goal of mine to have a release on there too, so it can also be popular. I don't understand why anyone would aspire towards a notion of popularity. I personally like being introverted. I like having very small network of people that I connect with and contact with in regards to music, because I'm very satisfied with the packages I get from people. I'll get one-of-a-kind tapes, things that obviously my friends have put a ton of effort into, and that to me is way more satisfying than selling out any tape or CD. It's just getting those things in the mail that I can tell my friends put their heart into, and they're sending it to me because they want me to enjoy it and have a little part of their life and my life too, basically.
I see that there's a lot of people when you discuss about something like there's a release that came out a couple of years ago, and when you ask, was it good? Well, I haven't had time to listen it. It is very usual for people that they have either bought or at least they know of something existing, but they almost never have heard it. So that it's like especially in old days, I think there was this hunger that you would be ready to hear anything you just get your hands on, and now maybe less so. It might be also because people are growing up, so they have less time. Work is taking the toll.
Yeah, full-time jobs and families could usually take away time from listening to noise tapes.
There's so much of releases, but seems to be like less discussion.
I feel like there's less discussion, not necessarily because of the oversaturation of noise, but the global sickness that has kind of possessed people in the past 20 or so years to just focus their time on the internet and think of the internet as being where the world is connected and where communication happens. But the truth is, the internet is a place where everything's archived, everything's viewable to tons of strangers. So I feel like people aren't really inclined to write about noise releases as much as they would if they were sending in reviews to a zine, for instance, because the only people who are reading that zine are people who have a personal interest in noise and the passion of it. But I feel now the position where people could post a review online and any fucking buddy could just look it up. I feel like people are almost kind of embarrassed to put more of themselves out there. People don't want to like put themselves out as much in the open out of fear of judgment, because when I talk to people one-on-one about noise releases, they're usually very happy to talk about it, but like these same people, I don't really see them posting reviews on the forums like Special Interest or Scream and Write, for instance, because there's these platforms obviously online where people can have these discussions about noise, but there's some kind of sickness that's just holding people back from being as extroverted and as fucking crazy about noise as realistically they should be, because obviously anyone who listens to noise is a little bit crazy, so why should you worry if people think you're crazy?
I don't remember when it became a kind of thing to collect everything from the artist.
Yeah.
Because when I started to be involved in noise, the first thing was that you didn't even know what existed out there. So there was no notion like, I need to collect every Grey Wolves tape or every Merzbow release, or like you was talking about the Hoffman having 2,000 releases. It's kind of impossible scenario that some artists, they are not meant to be collected in a way.
Yeah. I mean, well, there's some artists with like very concise discographies, like let's say the early AWB recording stuff, like Terra Blanche or whatever.
Yeah.
It's very established what tapes exist from that project, so hypothetically, you could collect all of them if you wanted to. But trying to apply that same mindset to Merzbow or Zan Hoffman is utterly fruitless. And I think a lot of people nowadays, they try to get that attitude with new and upcoming projects. A new project starts, so somebody will think, okay, I'll make it a goal to collect everything from this project. And it gets to the point where that project eventually puts out like a one-of-one release or something that's hyper-specific, only sent out to a few friends, and all of a sudden you have collectors who might be a little infuriated about that. And, I think it's great that there's collectors that genuinely care enough to actually have an opinion on things like that, but on the other token, it's up to the artist to produce whatever the fuck they want. It's not up to them to produce things with collectors in mind.
I think it might also change how you make noise if you consider the noise something that people are collecting. Yeah. Because I remember there was a Vomir interview in White Centipede Noise, and he mentioned because he usually gets a lot of critique for having releases that sound alike.
Yeah.
So they are very similar. And when he was explaining that, he never thought that people would actually buy everything. So there was like 50 copies tape somewhere in Asia released, and then there's like French label doing 50 or something. And the idea would be that people over there will buy it, and they are not hunting like the other fairly similar release.
Exactly, and Big City Orchestra in the 80s and 90s was a very similar example, because they had a very large output where they were releasing on pretty much as many labels as they could get in contact with, but with Big City it wasn't really an ego game or wanting to just be uber prolific. They literally just wanted their releases to be available in as many places as possible, and they never expected anyone to collect the 50 plus 100 plus Big City Orchestra label cassette releases on labels all over the world. They expected people in a certain part of the world would maybe get the 5 or 6 tapes that are available in their neck of the woods, and whatever else comes is a gift. But it gets to the point now where Discogs just makes it seem like very overly exhaustive, and people don't really know where to even start with an artist like Big City or Zan Hoffman, because there's not really any greatest hits compilations like there are in popular music, so they really have to dive into the deep end first.
Yeah. And this is something that you also talk about, that people have been saying that if Hoffman would have made like very selected, coherent album, he could be more popular.
More recognized, yes.
But then it is a kind of weird request. It's almost like asking a live band that don't play that many shows because I can't be on every show.
Yeah.
So as a noise band who makes 100 tapes, I think sometimes you would just need to kind of get in the mindset that you don't need the 100 tapes. You can experience the ones you actually just managed to get. It's almost like going to the live show, you don't need to watch entire tour from start to finish. You just grab this one show and then enjoy.
And going back to Von Meer, again, he's an artist who has a very specific sound. You only need 1 or 2 Von Meer releases to really know what you're getting into. And I think that's interesting in his case, especially because a lot of his stuff is very limited edition. It makes it so if there's a Von Meer tape and you've never owned anything from him before, you might as well add that one to your collection just to have that experience.
Yeah. But you mentioned that the prices for noise has been getting out of hand compared to even 5 years ago or something.
Right. Even 5 years ago, I used to be able to purchase a lot of 90s harsh noise cassettes, like Bob Marinelli, for instance. I got a lot of his tapes off Discogs a few years ago for $10, $15 a piece. But now I've seen auctions where all of a sudden Marinelli cassettes are being bid up to $100+. There's a lot of people who just have a lot of money to spend and are willing to engage each other in price gouging and bidding wars just to have the territorial control and have that specific release instead of somebody else.
If people think about Tribe, they might now associate it as a label with a lot of reissues.
Yes.
And is it something you are kind of comfortable that it still has sort of own identity, even if artists are not really exclusive for Tribe?
Right, yeah. I kind of enjoy the perception that Tribe is a reissue label because it makes it so when I produce records that are by new artists like Dead Door Unit, or I have a CD coming out from Hand and Knee and Mallard Theory, these are releases where it shows I have a lot of faith in them, that they could stand up to guys like Randy Grief or Macronympha. As opposed to labels that are just putting out strictly contemporary noise where it makes you think, well, what's special about this project?
Yeah.
I think people have come to expect a certain kind of weirdness with Tribe releases, so that even when I put out a modern noise release, even if people are a little bit jaded on noise, if they like what I do, they'll give it a shot anyway, and they might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Dead Door Unit was something that the CD you put out got a lot of good response. Just like 2 days ago, one friend sent a photo of the album saying like, so great album. And it is, I think there might be thanks to White Centipede Noise that his name got out there, because a lot of releases are so tiny, editions are like a private. I guess you have something like a kindred spirit to what he's doing when it's like
Yeah. Ken and I see very eye to eye on our philosophies and noise and producing tapes. Both of us make cassettes for the joy of making these fucking tapes. I spent a lot of time over at Ken's place in Philly, so we fleshed out a lot of our philosophies on noise making in general. I think the first tape I produced for Ken under the Dead Door Unit name was the Laugh at the Devil cassette, which, even for a cassette release on Tribe when that came out initially, it did make waves, so to speak. I remember the initial edition sold out fairly quickly, so I recently put Laugh at the Devil back into production on Purveyors, and Abandon happened to come out at a good time, right as Ken was doing the White Centipede Noise interview, and I'm really fortunate, I'm really appreciative for the response that album's gotten, because he worked on that for a long time. I listened to it from every step of the way. But it wasn't a case of somebody just like making a noise album from a single session and thinking, this is the shit, and putting it to record. This is really a case where that album, Abandon, is a personal narrative, so to speak. There's really a lot of layers to that record.
So you were talking about this having a similar philosophy on noise or with Dead Door Unit. I do have a bunch of friends who kind of passionate about noise in a way. You usually end up talking hours about noise.
And it's very, people get into noise for different reasons. A lot of people appreciate the live arena more. Some people appreciate cassette culture more. So to find somebody, who actually sees things eye to eye with me, who cares more about trading back and forth rather than playing live. That is that rare friendship to come by, and that's something I appreciate a lot about the people in Pennsylvania, like Ken or Dead Door Unit. Dead Door Unit or Cod Founder or Fricker, for instance. These are people who are really coming into noise, not with any pre-expectations, but just experimenting with sound. And that's the reason, I put the Pennsylvania crew in such high regard next to people like Randy Grief or the 80s artists that I work with, because it's a similar approach in terms of philosophy.
Yeah. How much you value the kind of the knowledge of noise history? In your case, obviously, when you think about label, it would at least be helpful that you know what's out there, you can evaluate sounds. I think there are a lot of people who haven't experienced even like 90s noise. So they hear some new recording and praise it, but then when you have a little bit of experience, not everything now is amazing. There's a lot of really great new stuff, but there's also something that the kind of a perception of past can be very helpful, at least in my opinion.
Yes. There's no inherently right or wrong way to enjoy noise, but I feel like if you expect to have some kind of standing within noise, if that's your aspiration to be able to be a part of a greater scene, I think you do need to be aware of noise history. If you just want to make tapes and just send it out to a few people, it doesn't matter what your taste in noise is. You can listen to anything. It doesn't matter as long as you're happy with it. But if you're trying to speak in terms of noise culture and trying to posture yourself as a label, for instance, you need to have a certain amount of respect for how things were done previously, especially in how these original tapes were presented. There's been cases in recent years where there's been CD reissues that have come out of albums that are previously cassette only, and packaging is not on target at all with the original release, or it's an analog tape and it's very clearly digital leveling or a complete mono transfer.
Yeah, there are a lot of remasters that in theory they sound great, but then I would prefer the kind of faithfulness for the original.
Yeah, and if you give it to someone who obviously knows their craft well, like Grant Richardson or Chris Lapke, they obviously know engineering inside and out. But if you attempt to remaster something yourself with no previous knowledge of audio engineering, it's just not going to come out well. At that point, you might as well just do a direct from tape rip to CD production, because that's still going to come out better than trying to remaster something yourself.
I'm quite confused sometimes why it would be a bad idea just to rip the tape and have it as is on CD.
Because some of the industrial recollection CDs, there isn't any actual remastering on it, right? Like the Trait Lund CD, I noticed that one, it's very lo-fi, but I like that a lot. It doesn't feel like you're really listening to a CD at that point. It feels like you're listening to a tape, but like a perfect tape that's never going to degrade with time. It really feels like a cassette recording.
Yeah. It depends on the release. There are some releases where minor tweaking is done. I usually respect the artist's choices unless there is something I can't accept. Like you mentioned, if there is a cover, not remake, but something new, I will need really perfect reason why change the cover art of reissue. There are a couple of cases when I have accepted that, okay, we do different cover than the tape had because artist had a good reason for it. Mm-hmm. But there have been a couple of occasions when I just had to say that not going to happen.
Yeah, because I've gotten submissions from people, where I'll do a reissue, and at very first they want to do like completely new artwork when the original cassette artwork, It's not essential to my enjoyment of the tape, but that was my first experience with that tape, was looking at the artwork and wondering what kind of sounds could lay behind this. It's the artwork that pulled me in, and I don't really want to take that experience away from other people experiencing it on CD for the first time. So my preference absolutely is to use original artwork, or at the very least, if they want it to be changed, do something similar, like the Macronympha crack reissue I did, that isn't the same artwork as the original release, but I scoured through porno mags to find a woman, some kind of scene that looks kind of like the transsexual that's on the original cover of Crack. Yeah. You don't see the woman's face on the cover of the Crack CD, but from the back, the hair looks kind of similar. So I showed that to Joe, and he was over the moon about it, and I thought for a redesign, that one turned out pretty nice.
Popularity of reissues, I have had no reason to really do much of them anymore.
Yeah.
Most of the releases happen simply because I get somebody outside make me a suggestion. Like when something like Dead Body Love reissues just fall in your lap, it's not like you're going to say no. Yeah,
you aren't going to say no to that, yeah.
Or Mondebrui box or Government Alpha or something, and it's Emanuele Bonini of Audio Dissection has been organizing a lot of these things, and I'm just kind of the guy handling the logistics of pressing and distributing.
Yeah, and it's nice when you have projects like that, specifically co-productions, where the other label is willing to take a little bit of work off your hands, particularly if you see eye to eye on the same things. The Sado Vision reissue that I did with Old Europa Cafe actually turned out really well. Rudy was very open to my suggestions. There were a few issues early on with the audio mastering from his engineer and the artwork, but he was very understanding when I gave him my tips on how it could be improved a little bit, and I think that's the best kind of co-production right there. Or Unexplained Sounds Group reached out to me because, they're a small label out of Italy, and they're working on a PBK CD reissue, and they reached out to me and asked if I wanted to split the costs and do that as a co-production. And I love PBK, and I love the idea of doing a CD for him, so naturally, since I won't be having to do too much work for that, USG's going to handle most of that, I could absolutely fit that onto my docket without having to stress about it.
PBK is one of these artists that there are a bunch of reissues that happened quite early.
Yes.
Some of his 80s stuff was already reissued in the 90s, so it was like...
and in the 2000s, a lot of it was being reissued on cassette only, but to find it on CD now is a little bit difficult, because I believe there are some labels like Monochrome Vision and Attenuation Circuit that were reissuing some of his stuff on CDR or ProPress CD, but the distribution of these, particularly in America, is not very high, and PBK, being an American artist, he absolutely does deserve that distribution a little bit more in America.
Yeah.
Especially because I do regard him very much as a pioneer of American noise. Macronympha cites him as an influence. Eddie Giles has cited PBK as an influence. PBK really kind of bridge the gap, between like that 70s era, as I mentioned earlier, of Tudor and Mama, kind of exploring it more into like truly harsh territories. There's a collaboration / split cassette that PBK did with Deaf Lions, and I think 1990 or 91, called Forming Mankind in Its Own Image or something like that. And the PBK tracks on there honestly could be a dead ringer for a mid-90s era Incapacitance fame. But there's this very drony influence where it's these swirling walls of psychedelic noise with a very Xenakis kind of electroacoustic drone taking place over it. And I do think his work is very forward-thinking and is in great need of reevaluation.
What I think Randy Grease is something you mentioned many times, and it also in your interview you mentioned that you visited Special Interest Forum to be surprised that there's actually topic of this. And I remember buying the LP from Ron back in the day, like somewhere possibly mid-90s, only because his tracks were on many compilations.
Yes,
and
he was
then,
on like 40 plus compilations back then.
and then the LP, I guess it was too big pressing, and he must have had a lot of copies because it was sold for like $8 or something like that. So when you looked catalog, and it's somehow like $8 for LP, and it seemed to be so great deal. And when I first got it, I wasn't completely impressed, but compared to a lot of other stuff, his material kind of grows. The older it gets, it just becomes more interesting.
Yeah, because I assume it's kind of the case where you got it back then from Triple R is almost a bargain release at $8, so you didn't really have that precedence to really think, okay, this is something really magical. You know, it was a bargain release, it'd probably get filed away pretty quickly. As the years have gone by, it sounds like you've seen that there's not really a whole else like Randy Grief's work.
Yeah. If you have to pick up some of these kind of highlights of Tribe reissues that you feel that they are not only your personal favorites, but maybe like a culturally necessary to do, what would be some of the highlights that people should be checking out?
Oh, yeah, that's a big question. I have to think on that for a minute or two.
There's a nice one with I just sold 2 copies of the Das Synthesiske Musikewebe, how you pronounce
However
it.
you say it, yeah. No, that's another project where collaborated with PBK again a little bit in the 80s and 90s. Really interesting project in how it explored these very broken sound textures long before projects like Spring of Life kind of revitalized the broken noise idea. And that CD I released for him pretty recently is just made from the sounds of malfunctioning piezo speakers and tape players.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, that's an artist I do think is culturally relevant. And even beyond the Tribe release, I think people could check out the back catalog and find a lot they'd enjoy there too. Kapate Music, Frans de Voord, I reissued Music on End, which is a really harsh, great album that was released on pre-owned tapes in the late 80s. You know, I think Frans de Voord, he's a name that's known for a lot of people, you know, either due to Vital Weekly or his work of Corn Plastics or his new book with Ron Lessard. But Kapate Music, again, is another one of those projects that was very influential on the 90s guys, like Macro, for instance, and I think kind of gets looked over more as, you know, maybe more of a sound art project rather than anything harsh. But they did have, like, a lot of very difficult listening electroacoustic drone releases, but Kapate Music would go into these very typically harsh noise zones, too, that I think people overlook fairly often.
Das Synthesiske Musikewebe.
DSM for short.
And I saw him play live shows, and I was, it was sort of joyful and warm, but sounding somehow kind of industrial. At those shows, he had a huge sheet of metal, and then he had only contact mics on this plate to 8-track mixer, and he was using just a mixer without any effects and all these weird mechanical toys dancing on the metal plates. And while it looked funny, it also was interesting when you could see every sound happening in front of you. Mechanical sound is because that thing moves on this sheet of metal, and it was really interesting to follow. And I think the guy is very well known for building these gadgets of like weird mechanical arms or something that rotate or create rhythms.
Right. And in a way, he kind of predated a lot of West Coast noise, a lot of California noise was very installation-based, speculum fight, pedestrian deposit, but Guido and DSM, he was one of the first guys to really be doing that kind of installation-based noise without any greater context to go off of. He was really creating these pieces just out of the joy and the exploration of it. Even though his music could be very dark, intense at times, there isn't any darkness in terms of personality that goes into it. In fact, recently he's been collaborating with his teenage son in live performances. The clips I've seen from that have been very cool. It's just as ugly and as nutty as it's always been. But, this is something I was talking about with Josh from Confounders recently, is that you can make very ugly, dark noise, but it doesn't have to be associated with any kind of negativity while you're creating it. A lot of the stuff I make sounds very disturbed, but I'm usually having a great fucking time while I'm doing it because I love making noise. And personally, I wouldn't want to associate it with those days when I'm feeling bad because I don't want noise to be something I just do when I'm pissed off. I want to be something I do when I'm happy because I fucking love noise.
Yeah, I made the interview with DSM for Special Interest 9. And when I sent him the free copies of the magazine, I got an email back and he said, "It's funny to be in the magazine with all these bad boys."
That's why it was amusing to me when I saw how accepted Randy Grief is now on the special interest forum because, I think a lot of people have the association that special interest, very harsh power electronics. They kind of assume, special interest and his fans, would kind of be in a little bit of a box with musical preferences. So it's very cool to see that a lot of people on the forum really have an interest in this old school tape culture stuff too, in addition to all the really harsh PE stuff.
Yeah. Originally when Special Interest started, the people who have been around might remember that there was not that many magazines at that time, and people might also remember how, before social media, forums were also kind of places where a lot of trolling was happening.
Yeah, I read about that a little bit in Ron's book, Voltronics and I Love Noise forums. Oh my God, what a train wreck.
Even if people might be kind of associating me with these notions of pissing off people, that as if that would be my goal, and it's absolutely not my goal, and especially in the context of magazine or forum, the idea. Obviously, there's this kind of leaning to what I consider industrial noise. It has a kind of root to industrial culture, but musically more in the noise expression. So there are a lot of somehow transgressive topics included, but musically the attempt was to bring back the diversity of expression, and that anything from music concrete, electroacoustic to harsh noise, and anything between would be kind of this larger noise scene. The catalogs what I received, and you'd have Genocide Organ, and then you have Kapot Musik, Orb, Mersbau, Current 93, Death in June. Almost anything.
Because, for instance, the Randy Grief topic itself wasn't anything new. I think I saw the topic on grief was posted probably 2010, but it's just been in the past year or so, that's been that renewed interest in his work. And that's kind of cool to see in general that as time's gone on, a lot of people are starting to reevaluate that 80s and 90s era again, the same way they might have been doing a decade or more ago when he started a special interest forum.
Yeah. What is the highest number of release you have done, pressing?
Highest quantity of anything I've released up until this point is still 300 copies. Actually, in the case of the slacking 7-inch that I issued, we went a little bit over just because of the pressing plan. So there are actually about 330, 350 copies made of the slacking 7-inch. And there's still a lot of those around, actually. I still think I have about 100 of those left, which I'm pretty happy with because I'd like that to be released, kind of like how you mentioned you purchased Grief's Bacteria and Gravity LP on Triple R. It's been available for several years. Ideally, I'd like this slacking release to be available for several years down the line, so people who are getting into this current era of noise, maybe 10 years down the line, could check that out and have something readily available and cheap.
I understand somebody living in apartment doesn't want 500 CDs under his bed of each title.
No, I live in a one-bedroom apartment, 700 square feet. Pretty much you have to walk around all the CDs and vinyl and crap.
So I understand that people don't want to press too much, but I'm usually very confident of something I release, and I'm very happy to sell it for next 10 years. I just think about what could be realistic, but I don't see it as a failure if CD that was made 200 takes 10 years to sell.
Yeah.
Because it's just something that is available.
Yeah, and there's definitely those releases, like again, Al Margolis, I did a CD, Iceless Faceless, which is a reissue of a tape he did in the early 90s. I pressed that one in, I believe, 2021 or 2022. I made 200 copies of that. I still have very, very many copies of that Al Margolis release, but Margolis, through his work with Sound of Pig and through his own musical output, that's a name who's pretty much, he was dubbed the cassette godfather at one point by Electronic Cottage Scene, so he's the kind of name that I'm proud to have in the catalog for at least a decade or going on more. Or we mentioned DSM earlier, that's another CD where that's not really something that, like, the noise public is going to reach out to right away. It's not going to sell out instantly, but it's just not about that for me. It's just about working with artists that I think are canonically important and I personally adore.
Network of dealers has been getting smaller in US. I think you are focusing more on selling by yourself, not trying to have a lot of distributors around the US.
Correct. There's a few distributors outside of the US that I work with pretty constantly, yourself included, Satatu Hata and Screamin' Rife. But as a whole, I don't seek out distribution as much to make money off of it, as much to try to get these releases heard by people in Europe and elsewhere. I've seen people release on other labels where there isn't any distribution, and people get a little bummed out that people in Europe aren't able to get a hold of this release they worked a lot of time on, and they want their friends to be able to get copies of it. So I do believe that European and international distribution is essential, but primarily just for making sure people could actually access this music.
I have a couple of different approaches myself. I think that not everything needs to be accessible, but there are a bunch of stuff what would be very annoying when you spend a few years working on something and then nobody will get it.
Yeah, for instance, like the abandoned CD, Dead Door Unit. If he worked all that time on that CD and then just nobody heard it, that would be massively discouraging.
Some of these albums that were landmarks in noise because they were available. Like, I don't think like Pulse Demon is even in top 10 of Merzbow CDs.
Not at all,
yeah.
No.
But it's just something that everybody heard it and so many people liked it and it became this almost iconic release.
For a lot of people, it's totally fine, but their exposure to noise will be through sampling albums on YouTube, and that's typically going to be whatever YouTube recommends them. So the first things they're probably going to check out are Merzbow, Pulse Demon, or GR by Deathpile, and It could give people a very limited idea of what noise and power electronics is supposed to be. For instance, GR is very different from a lot of other stuff Kennedy was producing under Def Pile and his other projects. But for a lot of people, if they want to get a clear, simple idea of what power electronics is, they'd listen to that album and think that, loud, clear vocals must be a proven rule of the genre. They assume that everything must sound like that or White House, when there's a lot of variation in power electronics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guy from Painel was here today, and he was pulling out GR. I had a second-hand checks on CD.
I saw that a minute ago, yeah.
And he was like, why you have this one? I was like, well, I just found it from the back room, and it's like, usually second-hand CDs are like €5. Like, €5? People are paying a lot of money for this.
Yeah.
And well, I know a lot of people appreciate the album, but I don't think it's among the best of the Death Pile.
Yeah, me neither. I prefer any of the stuff he was doing before, or the Urge Within tape that was released on Labyrinth, I think might be Kennedy's best work. It's very extreme in a very provocative, easy to understand way. People come into noise nowadays, unfortunately from the perspective almost as a meme, and will seek out things like Pulse Demon or GR because they're most indicative of noise as being completely insane and overbearing when, as we've spoken about, noise doesn't have to be something that's just full blasting in your face all the fucking time.
The Finnish audience, who might be the crowd who's actually listening to this, they know your work, for example, through 100,000 releases.
Yes.
And how did this collaboration happen, and did Mr. 100,000 have some input on the release or format, or how the release became?
Yes, so the release that Satatuhata did for me was the mini CD Zabriskie Manor. Initially, that wasn't supposed to be a public release at all. The original form of Zabriskie Manor was a C92 cassette that I sent around to a few contacts within Noise. One of those people was Dean of Robert Fuchs, who actually mentioned the tape on his White Centipede Noise interview as being one of his favorite recent releases. And having just been a private tape at that time, I didn't really expect anybody to like it. One side was pretty split evenly at the time, where it was just straight turntable noise, and then the other side was, as Vilho calls it, Playboy smooth jazz music. But I was pleasantly surprised that Dean was a fan of that. And I'd been in contact with Vilho at a few months at that point, and I saw a kind of similarity between the kind of music, very minimal noise that he's putting out, and the kind of turntable abuse I was doing. So I sent him a full rip of a C90 cassette and asked him what he thought of it. And from there, he proposed the idea of doing a mini CD, basically structuring the tracks where Zabriskie would be the harsh noise tracks and Manor would be the Playboy smooth jazz. And it was kind of a very collaborative process where I split it up for him, and he ultimately picked the best track listing for the release.
He has this kind of a golden ear to pick up things, and also visually he has many times input on how the release should be looking like.
This was a case where he actually allowed me a fair bit of creative control for the release. As soon as he told me that it was going to be, slim, small mini CD case, I sent him this image where it's an image of an apartment building somewhere in France that I found at a local thrift store that just had collections of these old 35mm photos. And when I was packaging the original copies of Zabriskie, I'd usually send those attached. So I sent a few of those to Vilho, and the layout ended up falling together pretty naturally. I used papyrus font for the release because papyrus font is typically considered to be garish and cheesy, and I thought it complemented the Playboy smooth jazz feeling of the release quite well.
I think 100,000 gives pretty much free hands, but if he sees something he doesn't personally care for, then he will step in to guide it into the direction of what would be suitable for the label.
Which I think labels should do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's up to a label to, kind of reel everything in and make sure there's a sort of cohesion between releases, not doing anything too wildly different while still being unique and creative with each release.
How do you think about uniformity in noise? When you think about something like Broken Flag, it's identity of the label that releases are looking alike. Then there's like pure CDs or ground fault CDs, but then there's a lot of labels where sort of artist identity seems to be slightly lost when it becomes like a series of material.
Yeah, like there's certain tropes that you'd recognize across the Tatu Hatu releases. Like the back flap is usually the logo in the same place. And for a long time, Satatu Hatu was using clear cassettes with red reels specifically on the majority of their releases. And I think uniformity is very good when it's reeled in a little bit. Like the past few years or so, all the Tribe Tapes cassette releases have the same back flap design on the spine, but at the same time, I open it up to the artist a little bit. For instance, if I do a release that's in a plastic bag, for instance, it doesn't make sense to do the same back flap idea, so I'll have a little bit of variation with the logo. But, other labels where every single release has the same back flap, same spine, with just maybe the cover art being changed very minimally. I think that's kind of a little bit of egoism where the label owner wants everything to fit into their niche of what the label should be. The label should have a little bit of control over the final direction of a release, but they shouldn't determine how the release turns out, because that'll lead to a problem where people are shaping their sound and their artwork choices specifically for the label that's asking them instead of creating what comes to them naturally.
Do you have any favorite labels that would have influenced Tribe Tapes?
Yes, primarily 80s and 90s labels. Prion Tapes in particular from Germany directly inspired the spine text that was used on a lot of the early Tribe Tapes releases, like Tribe Tapes Volume 1. This is during a time when I wasn't really counting on the label being anything big, so I directly emulated how their spines looked with the same font and everything. The only difference is all the Prion Tapes releases would obviously have their own logo on the spine, which I, of course, didn't include. Prion Tapes was a big influence on the design, Sound of Pig, Old Europa Cafe. Really, the list goes on. There's really so many 80s labels that just put out a few releases here and there and just vanished.
As convenient is doing a CD on Digipack, it also feels as if it would be creating this uniformity in noise where it's very hard to now think like what would be handful of latest CD releases, what would be something unexpected. Because there used to be, like if you would buy old Tesco releases, you wouldn't know what the CD will be.
What will it be packaged in?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a jewel case. And many times it wasn't Digipack. It was something like very unique. It was like treating the packaging as an art form. Yeah. And I think that is slightly different now, that there's a lot more focusing on something that is handy and convenient.
Yeah, and I think people could be taking, more creativity even with Digipacks or jewel cases, because there is a simplicity of sending it to press, but Also, I think the design should be a little creative. You know, I see a lot of digipacks where it's very simple album artwork on the front and then liner notes and Arial font or Century or something on the back. Well, I really approach the CDs I produce with Tribe the same way I approach the cassettes, where I do think of the artwork and the presentation as being just as important as the musical contents itself.
Yeah.
Usually all the CDs I design in-house, I cut and paste collages and then scan them. And it's a real pain in the ass making sure that it all fits the guidelines of a jewel pack or a digipack, or jewel case, I mean. But yeah, it's a personal touch that makes it.
You create basically noise out of joy, not out of like angst or depression type of things.
Yeah.
And how important is the content, visual or emotional or otherwise? Like,
I don't think it's necessarily important to the listener. In my own context of creating noise, the titles I choose, the artwork, there's personal significance. You know, it's usually related to events, or not even events, but just thoughts in my mind, just rough ideas. And, you know, it's cryptic. People aren't really supposed to understand exactly the personal narrative that I'm trying to tell, but it's cryptic enough where I think people could project their own feelings onto it and hear what they want to in my music.
when you get a release, are you going through all the like liner notes and the inserts and stuff, or are you listening?
I enjoy releases from time to time where there's a very strong, set visual component, like Narcolepsia, for instance, does a lot of tapes where there's several page zines packaged with it. And I think those are a really fun experience because that's a mixture of music and art where I'll be looking and flipping through each page while listening to the cassette. And I feel like that's a very guided experience per se. Well, let's say if I got like a jewel case CD and it's just the artwork in there, there is a little bit more a vagueness where my mind kind of fills in the blanks on what the artwork or, what the sounds are supposed to represent. That's not necessarily saying I like one approach more than the other. In fact, I really do appreciate the zine approach for the effort that goes into it, and because it's a really total feeling when you have zine and cassette combined.
You were talking in a White Centipede podcast about having spoken word on a release. And Oscar was talking about Nuoriveri when he has an album where he basically almost like an audiobook, he announces the band name and album title for the beginning of the CD, which is very rare that you have this kind of narrative approach, and also where the sound he is using is quite often very like figurative. They are the sounds you associate with something. It's different from like a harsh noise wall when you know what makes the sound. You make these association, and even with your stuff when you was talking about the Playboy kind of smooth jazz thing, and I didn't know your work so well when I heard the CD, but I wrote to 100,000 that what is this Love Boat noise? And I don't know, I don't know if you know Love Boat.
The Love Boat from the 70s. Yeah. Wonderful show.
Yeah. So I was thinking, what is this Love Boat noise? And he was like, exactly.
Yes. Deliberately cheesy, deliberately garish. During a lot of my stuff, I guess I might as well let you in on some of the secrets, but a lot of my noise is kind of based around misremembered memories, misconstruing the past. During my performance in Helsinki last night, there was a projection from this British structural film called Granny's Is, where it's basically using all this like psychedelic computer-generated imagery, very early computer generations, to kind of depict the mental deterioration of a director's grandmother through dementia. And that's something I kind of try to emulate, is this very like purgatory feeling with my music. Like, that's why there's a lot of loops that repeat kind of endlessly. I'm trying to incite this kind of delirium in the listener, and a lot of people tell me in response they enjoy my noise, but it's very exhausting to listen to because of the strong repetition and trying to make these tapes up to 90 minutes at a time.
Do you receive like listener feedback or compliments?
I like it when people give me abstract interpretations. When people just tell me, I thought it was really fucking great. Wow, how did you do this or that? Those kind of compliments, while I appreciate it very much, it does make me a little bit uncomfortable because, I don't know, I don't think a lot of people realize that this is mostly just me smoking weed and mixing a bunch of tapes in my bedroom. A lot of people could come to me and act like, oh, you're really trying to make some grand statement with this. And no, it's just noise. I mean, there's more to it, but you're not really supposed to get anything from it except just listening to it and enjoying it.
Did it change your way how to listen to records?
I think so. I do think listening to harsh noise has opened up my perspective and what I enjoy from other genres of music. You know, there's a lot of bands like, nowadays I've been listening to a lot of post-punk like The Fall or Swell Maps, stuff that when I was younger I felt was kind of obnoxious, but, you know, now being such a big fan of noise, I appreciate the organized chaos of bands like that. I'm able to hear better all the parts that are working in unison to make Swell Maps so great, for instance.
What type of things you think that it's most rewarding making of sound? Things that kind of drive you into these experimentations.
I guess when it comes down to it, just enjoying these experiences. I enjoy how noise music can give you experiences, put you in touch with sounds that you're likely not to hear in ordinary life. I'm sure for many people, going to a noise show is a very rare thing. It's not a very common thing to happen around the world. So throwing out a noise cassette, it kind of puts you in another world for its 60-minute or 90-minute runtime. It's something you can really lose yourself in, and that's what I like about the experimenting process. As I said before, I work a lot with loops that just repeat seemingly endlessly. I love the recording process. Usually my recording sessions go for a few hours at a time because I'm just kind of existing in this space with this sound as it happens.
I think there are so many ways to listen noise, and some types of noise fits well in the live situation. And then there's a noise that I think can only work in a solitude home listening.
Yeah, like you saw my performance last night, for instance, and it's very different from what you'd expect of me from hearing my recordings. The live environment for me kind of shapes the type of performance that I do. Like in that instance, performance venue in Helsinki, previously when I had done my rehearsals at home, it was very tape-based, very structured. I had one tape piece that would come in with a loop accompanying it. I'd do some tape effects on that microcassette recorder and fast forward and reverse. And the venue last night, I noticed the microcassette recorder, the microphone on it would make these very harsh sounds no matter how little of a noise I would make into it. So a lot of the sounds were just my breathing amplified or my shouting. And I intended the set to go on for about 25 minutes or so, but I cut it off because I went into this portion where it was a loud feedback drone. And after a certain point, the kind gentleman who let me borrow his mixer, he came onto the stage and started to turn down some of the volume levels to prevent any damage to his mixer. Well, at this point, this destroyed the illusion that I've been trying to create with the piece, so I decided to just completely cut it short instead. But I felt it worked perfectly because the live performance should be determined by your setting. And in this case, the people around me determined the natural end of that performance.
Already in early 2000s, I decided that there's no point on performing something which is restricted or pre-planned in so tight way that you couldn't react on what is happening in the audience or on the stage.
Yeah.
And this was some of the reasons why I changed the ways of the video material or not even having video material.
Right, because having expectations for how your set should go can ultimately backfire if you're planning for it to go exactly the same way every single time. Noise ultimately is a matter of improvisation. Even the people who have the most rehearsed, tight sets, like Jostad, for instance, that is a very different level of performing than what I typically enjoy doing. For me, it's more so about improvisation, and if I were to stick in a very singular frame of what I'm going to be doing, because I do have kind of a plan going into a show. I do have a selection of tapes that I picked out for the evening, but I might end up using one or two of them, or I might end up using all of them.
Do you play similar sets, or is every night different?
Every night is something different. Tantric Death is a little bit more constrained because, it's the same pedals that I'm working with night after night, so it's usually going to sound somewhat similar, but with a different structure. But the stuff I do under my own name, Max Eastman, it is always very, very different live. My own output is very different from release to release. I have a core philosophy, some kind of aesthetic that ties everything together. But, for instance, the last CD I put out in collaboration with Size Effects was field recording based. It was primarily inspired by wholly minimalist composers like Part or Schneidke, while still being relatively in the world of noise. While, for instance, last night when I was yelling into my microcassette recorder about smoking cigarettes, that had absolutely nothing to do with holy minimalism. It was holy degeneration.
How did you establish connections with Size Effects?
Stuart started out as a mail order customer back when my international shipping rates were a lot better. He used to purchase a lot of Tribe Tapes releases directly from me. And as time went on and it moved more distribution-based, you'd buy from White Centipede Noise and Sitatu Hata. And the Size Effects had already existed at that point as more of an improv-based duo project, but he started sharing some of the compositions. He started making it a more solo noise direction, and I was immediately interested. Particularly what fascinates me about his work is the sort of post-noise angle he approaches it with, which I find amusing. I see something very earnest about it while simultaneously tongue-in-cheek, because I think to describe any noise as post-noise is a little presumptuous, because noise is already a postmodern art within itself. It's based around the deconstruction of music. So for post-noise to be a thing while simultaneously linking back more musical elements as Size Effects does, I find it quite amusing. But on the collaboration CD we did, we kind of defied expectations because I provided the field recordings and these ambient classical collages, and he provided the harsh noise sections and assisted in the final mix of the material.
Has there been in your own work something that you would hope listener would kind of catch? Some of the like ideas or atmosphere behind the sound?
I hope that people catch up on some of the songs, quote unquote, that are contained on different releases. For instance, a lot of the C90 tapes, even though there aren't really any gaps, there are songs, actual pieces on these that are repeated on other tapes or motifs. For instance, I have this one cassette, Jesus Love /PCP, which is a C12, which is actually part of a longer session, a C90, which I released called When Doves Cry /Boys of Summer, not to be confused with Boys of Summer /When Doves Cry, which came out on detachment programs. Notice the titles are flipped, but it's a completely different, unrelated piece. And what I would hope to see people do is try to find connections, like try to find what releases are actually connected to each other, because there are a lot of secrets hidden in these releases, like same way where like Smell and Quinn would use like very specific samples, like at the beginning of the Music Should Hurt You comp, there's this gay porn sampler who's going, fuck my ass, and the same sample is used on Spermathalon and a lot of other Smell and Quim tapes. And yeah, I mean, it's a little bit harder to hear in my music because I don't have anything as entertaining as "fuck my ass," but you know, there's these sounds, these loops that are repeated on different releases, and I think if people tried, they could kind of piece or thread together all these tapes.
Yeah, the Smell of Quim sample is a classic, but I don't think it's a gay movie. I feel that it's like well, you might have ruined the pleasure for me.
Well, what else would it be? Whatever context would a man be yelling, fuck my ass?
Yeah, I think the sound is not a man, but it's like if you know the British ladies interested in certain activities, I think older lady might be sounding a little bit like that, and I think
so. It could be an older lady who thinks being processed.
Yeah,
okay.
I think we need to write to Dave, email, clarify, because it's almost ruining my experience.
Yeah, we need to ask Dave right now. Is this an old lady getting off, or is this some guy who just desperately needs to get reamed up his fucking meat hole?
But you mentioned Boys of Summer. Is it a reference for the kind of classic song?
Yes, by Don Henley, because my mother, she'd always make a connection between that song and my older brother, Danny, who's 27 years older than me. He passed away a few years ago from liver disease. God bless his soul. And yeah, for some reason, she'd always make this connection, like, Danny was a boy of summer, and there's a line in the song Boys of Summer that talks about like a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac, and back in the 80s my mom had that exact situation, a deadhead sticker on her Cadillac car. So yeah, and then When Doves Cry, the other part of that title, you know, that's a reference to Prince, who is one of my favorite musicians, and there's a lot of allusions to Prince within my music. I have another project, Kay Paisley. A lot of people think that's related to this noise artist, Kevin Paisley, who I was not aware of until a few months ago, but it's actually a reference to Paisley Park, Prince's recording studio, and also a song. And anyways, I chose When Doves Cry because also my older brother, Danny, my family visited the Caribbean islands or someplace back in the late 80s. They visited a little sound studio where they'd let you record like a demo tape of some song, and Danny recorded a demo tape of him doing karaoke to Kiss by Prince. And, well, naturally, I didn't think Kiss Boys of Summer would be a very good title, so When Doves Cry, Boys of Summer, yeah.
When you hear the song or read the lyrics, it has a melancholy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't know if you're familiar, it has been covered by the band called Pit Boss 2000. which
Not
is
familiar.
it's an American hardcore band, tough guy hardcore thing. The song itself is such a imprinted in mind of you don't need to know the original song because you have still heard it.
Yes,
If you live in the West, and it's something that it's contains sort of cultural information that is also very American.
Yes, and that ties in, you get it perfectly, because that ties into what I was saying earlier, where a lot of the themes of my music are kind of based around, like, these almost unconscious memories, like the Jungian concept of the collective unconscious, where, yeah, a lot of people listening to the tape might be vaguely familiar with the song Boys of Summer, but it is a pop song that's been played so many times, I doubt too many people have really taken the time to really listen to it and actually understand what the lyrics are about. And yeah, it's kind of just about, like, the vagueness that comes with our memories, the things that we perceive without really thinking about them too deeply. And again, the loops that I go with are kind of wallowing in that kind of mental uncertainty.
You mentioned that some of your sounds were done with VHS players.
Yes.
And then you also released VHS tape in year 2024. So what is the VHS thing?
I like them for the same reasons I like cassette tapes. It's an analog format. I like that you can hold it in your hands. I think VHS tape in particular has a very unique sound quality to it. It's kind of warbly. There's a lot of wow and flutter compared to cassette. So when you're looping short bits of audio and it has a little bit more wow and flutter behind it, it lends to it a little bit more of a broken quality. And in addition to that, I produce a lot of visual works on VHS since 2016. There's a few films up on YouTube, one of which is Satin Number 7, which is this film I produced in San Francisco where it's this purple satin sheet rotating over and over, and I processed it with some analog effects equipment where it almost looks like this metallic shuddering effect. And the accompanying soundtrack to that, a lot of the things on the Model of Malehood CD actually started out as soundtracks for these short movies. I self-released a VHS tape a very long time ago called Wunderlufi, which collects the same movies that were sampled for Model of Malehood. The title Wunderlufi is a derivative of It's a Wonderful Life, the Christmas movie, which VHS I recycled over to produce all this.
As you mentioned that you like the quality of VHS, but is there something that it's kind of crucial that you need to have VHS to achieve something that it couldn't be done with other things?
No, not particularly. I kind of like the VHS setup because it just sits in my room at home connected to these CRT TVs compared to, my cassette players or my pedal board for tantric, which I'm always disconnecting or experimenting with. The VHS stuff is kind of nice because if I get bored on an evening, I can just power on my TV and just start producing the stuff without having to do any preparation at all.
How much you experiment with like different gear? I found it sometimes amusing that the pause button on a tape deck can be so versatile instrument.
Yes.
That depending on a tape deck, some decks work differently. That pause will simply just cut it. And with other decks, you can just play it almost like a violin or something. You just delicately push it and then you can
slows down just slightly, and then those other tape decks, so if you press stop, it's accompanied by a very loud sound effect, almost like a whoosh.
Yeah.
So you could almost bring a kind of percussive element in the tape player, or as I spoke earlier about the micro cassette recorder, the onboard microphone, I like more than any contact mic. There's this really degraded lo-fi quality to it that just works perfectly.
Yeah. And yesterday when Aprapat was playing halfway of the evening,
yes.
But he had this fairly unusual vintage mixer.
It was beautiful.
Yeah, I don't think it's just the gear. The guy has his taste and skill to.
Yes.
None of the others had still this like unusual piece of gear what will somehow color the sound how it comes, and it's usually with a lot of older gear that is not necessarily meant to be used in a way like that. And I think the guys who designed that mixer didn't think that somebody will just blast in the red because it's like red, don't go there
Yeah,
type of
exactly.
thing. But it works so differently compared to a lot of new digital mixer now. Do you try to find pieces of gear, or do you just use whatever you have on your disposal?
I go on thrifting runs fairly often. I go to stores and try to find old, used equipment, particularly realistic brand I like a lot. There's a really strong warmth to realistic amplifiers or any kind of effects units. Anything from the 80s or 90s that is analog and non-digital, I will probably check out if I find it around used and cheap enough. One of my most recent acquisitions that I use on the tour tape, 11 Signs, is this Nakoto digital echo processor that's intended for karaoke, but it's this rack-mounted echo system where it has an onboard pitch shifter where it pitches things down in steps, like one note, two notes down, and so forth. And it also has onboard echo as well as a stereo simulator, which comes in handy because one of my VCRs only has a mono output on it. So I line that into the stereo effects unit on this digital echo processor, and it really expands the sound into something different. And this is a piece of equipment that's not meant for any kind of recording content. This is just made strictly for recreational use, karaoke, but I kind of repurposed it to go along with the whole VHS setup that I spoke about earlier.
I remember you talking in an earlier interview that you occasionally had this urge to ask some old guys how did they made certain sounds on their releases.
Right.
But is there like artists that influenced you in a way that you don't want to copy it, but you are curious about how could something like this be made? Are there some mysteries still?
I guess I don't really think so much about the ones that I can't figure out how they're made. For that, I enjoy it from a purely abstract perspective where I'll listen and try to think in my mind, how did they get that sound? But usually, or at least in the past, because I can't really say if I'm inspired by anything now. I feel like I'm so far out on my own direction that I just do what comes to me. But, my biggest influence going into this was Manoy, who, like Zan Hoffman, would record like 1,000 tapes back in the 80s. And a lot of Manoy's recording, he would do just 4 channels, guitar, microphone, shortwave radio, and maybe a synth. And he'd record most of these pieces very early in the morning, like 4 a.m. in his bedroom. And there's something about that really hermetic style of recording, especially because, in those days I was a bit of an insomniac, that inspired me a lot. Manoy, one of his best tapes is called Celebration of a Sunrise, and that title is inspired by the fact that very often Manoy would stay up to the sunrise recording, and when he would see the sunrise on the horizon, that was the end of a recording session, hence Celebration of a Sunrise. He completed a piece. And yeah, I really like Manoy a lot. I feel like he's a very understated artist, and I feel like even now, there's been a few reissues of his work, but I think he really deserves an evaluation. I mean, PBK has pretty much archived almost everything he's done, minus a few hundred releases, because PBK got a lot of the master tapes, but no one really speaks about this guy.
I think there are quite a lot of other guys as well. When you look at the Sound of Pig, for example, and you can see like John Hudak.
Yes, I love Hudak.
Yeah. His name wouldn't come up very frequently in current discussions.
Yeah. Or John Wiggins, too,
Yeah.
another very principal name of the 80s. I feel like it's definitely correlated to who's reissuing this material. For instance, Lund is a name who'll come up in conversation because you've reissued a good amount of his work. Hands, too. New Forces has been doing a series of excellent reissues, and now my focus on Randy Grief, I think, for sure has brought some of these artists some reevaluation, and I do hope in time I could find something to do with Minoy. I feel like just because there's so much of it available now in a digital form, I kind of worry that people might not take, CD reissues with the same urgency that they do like Randy Grief. Like, oh, first time this stuff has been remastered or available in 30, 40 years. And I don't know. I have a massive amount of respect for the work that PBK has done preserving the Minoy stuff, but there's a part of me that feels like it should be teased to the public a little bit more so they could really want this stuff as opposed to having it all out into the open at once. But I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it, truthfully, because I am glad I have like 300 Minoy albums digitally now. For me, it's a blessing.
Yeah. Earlier we talked about this thing about collecting everything.
Yes.
But then when you collect everything, how deep you can actually go into one particular release. And I used to collect anything done in Finland. But now when the magnitude of stuff is so big, I don't have everything. Everything done in Finland.
Right, obviously, because now there's so many different labels going on. There's one I wanted to ask you about, though. Scattered Productions. Was that Feudal Existence who ran that, too?
Yeah.
There's a lot of really interesting projects on that label. Essaton, Wreck is really good. They have this tape, Degeneration, where side A is this very brooding industrial, and then side B is almost kind of a techno hybrid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I released a grunt tape on a label. Scattered Productions released one grunt tape in, I think, 96.
This label's one of the best in old school Finnish noise. I wish more people knew about it.
So the guy, he used to play in a junk drome.
Yes.
Freak Animal released a 10-inch split with incapacitance, and so it was a Scatter Productions guy, and I was the other member, and we did also like a droning ambient kind of recordings. It was like middle 90s. We both lived in eastern Finland, about, well, I guess 15 kilometers from each other. We had a couple of sessions, and there has been some talk about reissuing some of the stuff. Junk drummers were all like influenced by like Ramble or Skullflower type of guitar drums based material.
Oh, yeah.
But then our Cosmonauts Hail Satan was also one of the very almost obsessive appreciated. But the British sound of like this, after power electronics came this guitar weird monotonic like Godflesh type of thing. So
that's sick though. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of a junk drum thing, that is Godflesh, Ramley, Skullflower, Cosmos Hail Satan type of thing. But that guy ran the label, and I think it's very easy to contact him. You just write the email if you know who the guy is. And
yeah, send me his contact info. We should get something going.
Yeah, I think Feudal Existence is...
I don't know what it is about that project that speaks to me so much. Something about drum machine abuse and just how fucking noisy it is. I see it labeled as noisecore typically online, but this isn't like Discharge or anything else. It's like really furious material.
Yeah. And it's mostly done with a computer, but the computers were different back then.
Was he using tracker software for it? Kind of like Nossenballoon and a lot of old techno guys, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's it is also something worth to maybe discuss, that something like labels like that was born out of small town teenagers being bored.
Yep.
And I think it's different now in the underground. And I don't know how many labels or bands are born out of being bored with life in general. And then
That's how Tribe Tapes started, pretty much. You know, I'd fallen out with a lot of my friends. I was just doing too many drugs all the time, making a fucking fool of myself. So I stopped doing all that, and it's like, what am I going to do with my time now? So with all the cassette culture stuff I was inspired by, I did great humor, and yeah, got me on the right path in life. Bored as hell in my mom's house is how it all started.
I'm rarely bored, but I can appreciate the notion of being bored.
I haven't been bored anymore since doing the label. Now my life this is everything I can ever need. I'm in Finland doing an interview. Wow.
We talked about with Pain Appendix, because he has been collaborating with a lot of Finnish guys, and
he's definitely kind of paved the way for me, too. He was a big help, you know. I'd already worked with Janne, Atrofist a little bit on Tribe, but, you know, Pete was the first person to really tell me, you know, hey, the Finnish tour route is a real thing that could happen. Get in touch with Janne, and you can make something happen with this. And, yeah, so I really have Pete and Janne to thank from the bottom of my heart for making this possible.
American noise guys focused on American scene. And in 90s, you used to be focused on Japanese.
Japanese noise, yes, yes.
And at some point, there was like a late 90s, let's say early 90s, there was also like German heavy electronics. There was a cold meat scene happening. Also, 90s was very strong. Finland has been one of these things which is almost globally noticed as something a bit different.
Yes.
From elsewhere.
There's a lot of interest in America in the Finnish noise scene right now, particularly the work that Satatu Hata is doing. I feel like there's been a little bit of a revitalization.
What were the reasons, like you are here now, but why you would want to be here?
You guys don't really care about being really popular is the big thing. You guys, you know, it's very isolated out here. You guys like making noise for the sake of noise. That's why I like making noise. Like when I was at the Helsinki gig last night, you know, typically at American Noise Show, it is gossip about other American noise artists. People here, you know, were talking about herbs, they were talking about beer, they were talking about shit that actually matters in life. They were talking about life, and when we talked about noise, it was about, you know, the mutual things we enjoy in noise. America has a sickness where people want to be stars. People think that if they aren't noticed, then their life is some sort of failure, which is really sad because most people are forgotten throughout history. The majority of people, they will have one thought about them one day, and then they fade into oblivion. And, you know, no matter how many noise tapes we produce, one day it's all going to be nuked by the fucking sun. So, yeah, I like Finnish guys because you guys are minimalist, and you don't care about popularity. You don't care about impressing anybody. It's just for the sake of you and your collaborators.
Yeah.
And that might be a generalization. I'm sure there's people out here who do have more nefarious motives and do want to be popular, but it's not as omnipresent as I see in the United States.
There are impressions of what Finnish, either the sound or the type of people, there are certain ideas, and I think I might be one of the guilty ones of creating certain atmosphere, how people see the Finnish scene, but it has always been quite diverse.
Yeah.
But it's just certain qualities are so strong.
I assume you mean a lot of people have an association more with power electronics, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or all something obnoxious or harsh, and
maybe so, but like I don't know. Like I've known about your work, I've known about Bizarre Uproar since I was very, very young. But to me, it's very much like, oh yeah, it's like fucking rock and roll and shit. I mean, like Bastard Noise would work with you guys back in the day. Like as far as I saw it, like it's just a country of wild people doing their own thing. And I see that same spirit, Satatu Hata, the kind of music on there on average, there's some artist overlap. It is a little bit different from Freak Animal, for instance, but I see it as another piece of the greater picture. And maybe some people in America have had the perception, oh, Finnish guys, they're all fucking crazy. They're all harsh. It's always that all the time. But me personally, it might be because I've gotten into it more recently, I've never had that connection.
But I think now it's changed a bit, but it's more like expanding. Also, Pain Appendix proved that you can actually tour Finland.
Yeah.
It's not very common.
And I want to make a point clear to the audience, too, that, the Finnish people are very hospitable to us. I don't know how the fuck I did it, but between, admission and merchandise sales, I was able to pull in 300 euros last night, which is unexpected in America. That kind of thing does not happen over there.
Yeah, and it was Wednesday.
Mm-hmm. On a Wednesday, hump day, middle of the week. Yeah, so there's definitely something here, and I definitely encourage anyone in the U.S., try to make this possible if they're in touch with the right people. I'm not saying cold call everyone. I'm not saying, email Mikko and get him to set you up with a bunch of shows, but if you have the connections and you can make it happen, then do it.
A lot of people who actually make it happen, they are not necessarily known worldwide. Mm-hmm. Like Janne of Atrophist, he's one of the most hardworking noise show organizer, but he might not get the credit he would deserve.
No, he's a secret champion of Finnish noise right now. Like his output is fucking incredible. The tape he did for Tribe was great. He has a new one on narcolepsy that blew me out of the water. And just his work right now of making shows happen and connecting everybody in Finland is very admirable.
Yeah. And Sam, you also published other Finnish stuff like Jazz Hand, Lusters.
Yixi.
And Lusters is also one of the Edge of Decay guy. He's one
Circle of Shit.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's they are doing a lot of things in kind of advancing the culture, so to say.
Yeah. They're very different, those Lusters guys. The kind of noise they're doing is very musically inspired at times, especially Circle of Shit. And the performance last night, he had some very bizarre cover version of Satie's Gymnopedes playing through his set. And that's a piece that I've heard so many times before. I was a little tired out, but in the context of his set, it felt something new, something different to my ears.
When we are doing this interview, like how the Finnish tour will be going, but the venues you are going to play will be quite different from Helsinki.
I could imagine. Yeah. I've expected the turnout for, Tampere to be a little bit lighter. It's a smaller area. Turkey, I'm very excited for. I think that should be a great show. Yeah. New Boyfriends will do an excellent job.
You are not a live noise guy.
No.
But how much have you played in the U.S.?
I've played a good amount of shows because people ask me to play them, and, if they want me to play a noise gig, I'll come out and do it. I'll show people what I do. To quantify it, I'd probably say I played about 50 gigs in the U.S., but mostly on the East Coast. I've never gone west. I've never been up to. I was supposed to play a show with John Olson in Michigan a while ago, but scheduling conflicts got in the way, so. But more so than anything, I'm very interested in playing more in Europe at this point, for meeting people and also just having a chance to explore the world, because this tour in Finland is the first time I've ever left the United States, period.
It's the first time outside.
First time out of the United States, never even been to Canada.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you seen anything here? Is there anything different?
It's very different from the U.S. It's funny because the area of Helsinki we're staying in, we were told by everybody, oh, it's a horrible place, very ugly, very ghetto. Compared to where I live in North Carolina, it's like a utopia. Like, literally, in my apartment complex, any hour of the night, like, there's people breaking into cars. The other night at 4 a.m., there was a crackhead who kept knocking on my door and wouldn't fucking leave because he was convinced for some reason that my address was also his plug's address. America's a fucking shithole. And for the record, the area I live in, Raleigh, is considered to be one of the safest places in America, quote, USA Today. America's a shithole. In 20 years, it's all going to be nuked. I'm telling you now.
Yeah.
Controversial statements from Max Eastman, but yeah, you heard it here first. There's just too much disparity is the issue. They have these very wealthy, built-up areas where they're trying to build up areas where the majority of people are unemployed and aren't making any money, so they have to resort to crime in order to make any ends meet.
Yeah. We had some American guys come to Finland for noise shows, which is sort of weird, but also back in the day I used to travel for noise shows. Nothing was happening in Finland. In 90s, there's no shows happening in Finland.
So you used to fly out to the States sometimes?
I went to States as well, but mostly UK or Sweden or something like that. But now it feels weird that people come to see basement show with like Bizarre Opera or something, and they fly across the world to come to the show with 30 people. Even more amusing was that there's a couple of American guys, they rented a place from this Helsinki city area called Malmi, and they were talking about how clean the city is, how there is no degenerates in the city.
Yes.
And then Malmi, if you ask any Finnish guys, they would say that this is the worst. It's like absolute shithole of Finland.
But it's not. It's beautiful here. It's fucking perfect. There's no litter in the streets. Like everywhere in America, it's just filled with McDonald's bags on every single piece of sidewalk, piece of grass. Like, America is literally turned into a trash heap for people's apathy. People here, when they smoke cigarettes, they actually put it in their ass pocket and don't just throw it on the fucking ground. They actually care about their country because they love Finland.
Yeah.
And I love America, too, from the bottom of my heart. But the American people, and I don't mean this in any political sense. I mean this in a social sense. The American people have let me down.
When we talk about, for example, American 90s noise, it usually means Deadline and Mother Savage, but nothing else. But I think when you actually look at the America in the 90s, it was quite different.
There's a lot more labels happening, Spite, Labyrinth, White Tapes. The late 90s, I really feel like was kind of the beginnings of shit noise.
Yeah.
Before it was dumbed down by Shit Noise Records and all those terrible CDR releases. But, people like Bob Marinelli were doing this very 90s kind of noise that I think was a clear influence on a lot of the 2010 shit going forward. That's why, as I mentioned, people now are willing to pay $100 for Bob Marinelli stuff, and I mean, a good deal of that is owed to Hospital as well, who's been doing a lot of really great 90s reissues. Like, I think the best stuff coming out on Hospital right now is the Marinelli stuff or the Abfall reissues. Hopefully there could be an Angel Dust Horror reissue in the near future, because I think there's a lot of late 90s noise that is drastically overlooked in the time being.
Have you checked out the 666 volt battery noise?
I want to get the reissue. The box set looks fucking amazing. But yeah, he's very similar in vein, though, because I've heard some of his earlier tapes. It's very similar to what I'm talking about with Bob Marinelli. Very lo-fi, almost kind of shit noise approach. Very eccentric at points.
I don't know if it's unique for the older noise, but nothing is guaranteed. When you buy a tape, I think now when you buy it, you can basically trust they will just deliver. But it was also, this gamble was almost like, I don't know if you like movies, but like exploitation movies. Like, I'm not a big fan of exploitation movies or horror movies, but I like this adult movies.
Yeah, or like I was talking with Moosehead last night. He and I are big fans of Russ Meyer movies, but, you know, the best Russ Meyer is when there's a little bit of story to go along with all the gargantuan tits, you know? Yeah. And a lot of noise is the same way, where the 90s stuff, very amateur, it could just be musicide, like these huge feedback squeals and nothing else, which I enjoy that strictly for the stupidity of musicide, but, you know, I like a little bit more meat with the potatoes, if you know what I'm saying, yeah.
And for me, it was always also the kind of a hunt for that thing, and you had this idea of something. And with the movies of this type, cover usually promises more than the content.
Yeah.
But with some of the releases, the idea might be more grand idea than what is actually there. And
exactly.
You get all hyped up about almost like an exploitation movie, that the movie isn't necessarily that great, but you still enjoy it.
That's the same comparison I've given to people whenever I try to explain, you know, noise that's very negative or violent, that it's the same enjoyment you get from exploitation, that this is something wrong, and sometimes it's fun to enjoy some things that are fucked up or that you wouldn't get in ordinary life. You know, it's a Baudrillardian limit experience, those things that push you to your mental and emotional limits.
It's another quality of noise what is different from past. Because when I organized the very first live shows, the thing was that you would try to get anybody you know, all your friends, to come to the show. It wouldn't be necessary for noise audience, but it would be just whoever you could invite to the noise show. And I think that has changed a little bit.
It has changed very much in the past 10 years because, as I said, with the global sickness that has infected the United States, people don't really care to come out to shows. People are too scared to walk out of their fucking front door because someone might talk to them and disapprove of them. In America, if anyone ever disapproves of you, you are legally required to feel like shit and ostracize yourself. So people don't really come out to shows if they are invited, unless they really have some band that they really want to see or some ulterior motive to come out. And this is like this, even back in the days when I was in grindcore and noisecore bands, people wouldn't really come out to this kind of thing unless they had an excuse, if it was a party or something. Because the United States, you know, obviously here you guys can be rowdy and have fun with it, but in the United States, everything has to be a fucking party nowadays. Ron Lessard wrote about this in his book around 2006, 2007. It stopped being about putting on good shows and started being more about partying.
The book was great. I need to write Ron about it. I was just talking with a friend yesterday about the book, and he was complimenting it to another friend. The book is obviously the Emil Balileo RR Records book.
America's greatest living noise artist. Yeah.
I once asked, so who is the greatest dead American noise artist?
What did he say?
John Cage.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
So here's it, obviously, John Case.
Yes. And that's what I'm saying is future generations, we need to preserve the legend of Emil Bolio like Ron preserved the legend of John Cage and David Tudor. And and if people today could learn the people that Ron was inspired by too, that'd be terrific. But in the meantime, it's my generation's duty to fucking pick up the pieces and preach the good word of Triple R.
Yeah. It was something that when I was reading the book, I was always like, where's the tissue? Because it was so good noise stories that it was Mersbow in American tour.
First American tour, yeah.
4 guys.
And Henry Mallard visiting with his mother when he's 11 years old. Henry Mallard is America's fucking sweetheart. I swear to God, Mallard Theory 20 years from now is going to be the only American noise project anyone gives a fuck about. Yeah. Dead Door Unit too. And I can't expand the list anymore. Or else, But Mallard Theory,
I think it was said by, it was either Franz de Waard or Rico. I think they both had this idea that nobody is going to write noise history unless the noise guys are doing. And they finally decided that, why should we wait the history of noise being written when we can actually do it?
The initiative of it, because already this is history. Noise is something that could be preserved and adored if we just take the actions to actually put it in writing and document this. And it's another thing I'm so glad Franz did this, because a lot of people at the advent of the internet, they assume Discogs and Instagram posts, that's enough to archive things. But we need written testimonials like we did with the Triple R book, for instance.
Yeah. There is coming the Broken Flag book, and for example, Murderous Vision published his own book.
Yes.
It's more like industrial, but still, at some point, I would have been slightly amused of artist putting out his own celebration book. Who's going to do it unless we are going to do it?
Yeah,
so that is something like the Rita doing art book, Murderous Vision doing art book, and it's not something that you should necessarily need to wait. Like even in this case, you just happen to be here and we just do this interview, and it's something that can be done.
Yeah.
And hopefully inspires people.
Hopefully some people will listen to this and find something good to pick up from it.
When I was listening to you interview from White Centipede Noise, there was many of these pointers what I have been referring throughout the interview.
I was also not drunk during the White Centipede Noise interview, so people will take of this as they will, but in any case, I appreciate their attention and time.
So that's a disclaimer. I have been buying you beers during your time in Finland.
Yes, disclaimer, Mikko has been buying me Sandals beers with a great Finnish war hero on the can, so, yeah. Any changes in attitude could be attributed to Mikko.